Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome Ariane Bankes to talk about The Quality of Love, the book about aunt and mother who were integrally involved in the latter part of Orwell's life, and she has some amazing insights that you won't get from anybody else in consequence. Ariane, over to you.
Okay, good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for tuning in. And I'm really delighted to be speaking to the Orwell Society about this book, which actually was published on Thursday, the 2nd of May, The Quality of Love, Twin Sisters at the Heart of the Century, about my mother, Celia, and my aunt, Mamaine Paget, who were identical twin sisters, born in 1916, and whose lives were intimately linked with not just Orwell, but Arthur Koestler, Albert Camus, and to a lesser extent, André Malraux, Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, Sashi Sitwell, Edmund Wilson, Robert Conquest, some of the sort of most important intellectuals really in the middle of the last century. So I'm actually going to share my screen because I'm going to take you through a lot of images and talk, as it were, sort of talk you through. I mean, I don't know how many of you know anything about their background. I'm sure that almost all of you know really the story of my mother's friendship with George Orwell, and also of him giving to her his list. But I don't know how many of you know their family background and where they came from and how they got to meet him. So I thought that I would take you through the whole story, really, but I'm very much going to focus on the period during which both Celia and Mamaine knew Orwell, and take it from there. This is the book. So my mother and her twin sister were born identical twins to Eric Morton Paget and his wife Georgina in Suffolk, Melton, just outside Woodbridge, in September 1916. And their mother tragically died of complications from their birth only a week after they were born, leaving their 50-year-old father absolutely bereft. It would have been an extraordinarily happy marriage. And he didn't know what to do with two tiny babies who both showed every signs themselves of expiring within weeks of their birth. And what on earth was he going to do with them? He was poleaxed by grief. And anyway, they pulled through, and he found for them an absolutely marvelous nanny from Devon, Ellen Mitchellmore, the sort of very sort of upright, genteel, honourable, reliable, marvelous woman in her 50s who came to live with them from Devon and remained with them until the twins went to school at the age of 10. So here are the twins. They had an extraordinarily isolated rural childhood, really. Their father, their nanny, there was a gardener, there was a maid. Their father was too old to fight in the First World War, and he was well off enough to live in a reasonable house. He had no car, they had no electricity. They led a very simple life, and they didn't go to school. Here they are. They were absolutely inseparable from the moment that they were born, really. They had no siblings. An earlier child of that marriage died in infancy. And so they grew up in this rural community. Their father was so poleaxed with grief by his wife's death that he was normally a diffident man, and he became more and more reclusive as the twins grew up. He, however, was deeply musical, and very well read. And he had a library stocked with books and a pianola. And the twins absolutely adored him and they. And he was really their main companion. And they brought sort of laughter and light into his life. They brought him back to life after the grief of losing his wife with their extraordinary comments and their antics. They wanted nothing more than to be boys. They found it excessively boring being girls. They didn't want to wear dresses. And they were absolutely delighted when they were taken to a blind hairdresser at the age of about 5, who thought they were boys because of their high little piping voices, and gave them boys' haircuts, which you can see here on the screen. Here they are with their nanny and with Mr. King, the gardener, and on the right with their dog, Scrap. Anyway, when they were about 7, their father made a very rare visit to London and came back looking graver than usual and said nothing, but slowly they gleaned that he was ill, that he'd been given a very unwelcome diagnosis. And they were absolutely horrified when they heard him say to one of the villagers, "When I die, you must take over the Bowls Club." And they realized that things were going the wrong way. They became increasingly fearful. And indeed, the worst happened. And they were sent away to boarding school. And while they were away at school, he died when they were only 12 years old, really depriving them of the absolute rock and anchor and center and stability of their life. They had very few relatives, except, well, their mother was one of 3 siblings, and her brother was an extraordinarily wealthy man called Jack Paget, who had, his ancestors had made their money in the Derbyshire coal mines. Actually, they came from Darlydale. And they lived in a vast house called Ibstock Place in Roehampton on the edge of Richmond Park. This is the house on the left. And they had 2 daughters, Winnie, 3 years older than the twins, Anne, 3 years younger than the twins. And they were really the only relatives that the twins could go to. So they were taken in by this family, and they found themselves living in a house, this huge house, this mansion, which had 18 servants, including a night watchman whose head was higher on one side than the other, and a butler, and countless cooks and maidservants and gardeners and goodness knows what. And it was absolutely baffling to them. But their aunt and their cousins were extraordinarily sweet to them. Their uncle, however, was a man of deep eccentricity, and he was a vegetarian, he was a theosophist, he believed in reincarnation to the extent that he actually believed or thought or came up with a theory that his younger daughter Anne, aged 9, was a reincarnation of William Pitt, the younger, because he had a portrait of William Pitt on the dining room wall, and he had measured the size of William Pitt's skull and the size of Anne's skull and come to the conclusion that as they were identical, she must have been him reincarnated. And he was only disabused of this notion when he invited her down, aged 9, to regale his lunch companions with some of the speeches that she'd made in the house in 1932. And of course, 1832, sorry, and of course she couldn't do it. He was extremely eccentric. The twins called their vast new opulent house Poverty Hall because, he kept the light bulbs at the minimum level. And when he traveled, he always traveled first class, but sent his family steerage. But in fact, although he was very sort of stingy at home, he was also extraordinarily generous, and he felt very strongly about the fate of the miners, from whom he had made a wealth. And he paid for retired miners who were ill to go and recuperate in sanatoria. And on one occasion, he read in the newspaper about Eglantine Jebb, founder of the Save the Children Fund. And he thought this was so splendid, and she must be such a splendid woman. that he tore the scrap, the advertisement for Save Children out of the newspaper, and pinned it to a cheque for £10,000, which that was in 1927. In today's figures, that would be £750,000. And he sent it off in the post, just pinned to a scrap of newspaper. And I mean, it electrified the charity. It set it, it turned its fortunes around completely and ensured its future. And in fact, he remained on the board of Save the Children Fund and he died. So he was a man of real extraordinary contradictions. And the twins found it very difficult living with him because he would have huge rages and very sort of dictatorial moods, and the whole family were united in alarm and apprehension. Anyway, the twins were sent away to a series of absolutely dismal boarding schools where they learned precisely nothing, and they were also so themselves overcome with grief at the loss of their father that they were in a very sort of febrile state of mind. They developed asthma when their father died, which is in fact often a psychosomatic condition. And by the age of 15, their health was so parlous that they were in fact sent away to Switzerland, to the mountains, where on the, with the view that the mountain air would do them some good. And they spent 3 years in a finishing school above Lausanne, which they absolutely adored. They met girls from all over Europe, from France, from Germany, from Italy. They learnt French, German. They were very good linguists. They had a marvelous musical ear. So they very quickly picked up languages. There were American girls there. They were away from the awful, miserable, damp English schools they'd been sent to with their dour and bitchy classmates who bullied them mercilessly because they were small and fragile and thin and miserable. And they flourished. Fast forward, they longed to go to university, but with the education that they had, there was no chance that they would ever be able to do that. And also, their aunt and uncle simply thought that the only point in having daughters was to marry them off as swiftly as possible via the season. So they were forced to become debutantes. In 1935, they were presented at court, and they made an absolute splash because they were very beautiful and almost exactly identical. And they became the toast of London. And they were simply determined not, they found the whole thing an absolutely futile waste of time. And they enjoyed dancing, but they had no intention of marrying any of the men that they met at all these extraordinary sort of rigmarole of dances and balls and cocktail parties and tea parties and lunches and everything. But because they failed to pick up a boyfriend, as it were, or contract an engagement, they had to do the whole season not once but twice, to their rage and fury. However, when they were 21, they came into a very modest inheritance that had been left to them by their father. Oh, these are a few more pictures of them taken by Norman Parkinson on the left, and indeed on the right, where they were bridesmaids to somebody called Violet Fusis. Here they are modeling on the right for Harrods. This is on the left, a photo by Dorothy Wilding. They were pretty sensational. But when they were 21, they managed to escape. And they moved into a small house off Drayton Gardens in Fulham. And Mamaine, by this stage, had met and fallen in love with Dick Wyndham, who was an extraordinary figure. He was a bohemian to the end of his fingertips. He was from the great Wyndham family, who owned Clouds, the great estate in Wiltshire, that had been the centre of the Souls. But he had sold his Clouds. He didn't want to be, to live in a vast house and estate. He was a bohemian. He was a painter. He studied with Wyndham Lewis. He was very close friends with Cyril Connolly, Peter Cornell, Sashi Sitwell. Sir Cheverel Sitwell was his absolutely closest friend. The composer, Matthew Smith, the painter. He was an arch bohemian, and through him, the twins were introduced to this circle and they never looked back. So this is Dick on the left. He was tall, handsome, lantern-jawed, and he swept them off their feet. He was 20 years older than them, but he fell madly in love with Mamaine. He'd already been married twice. He had 2 daughters by previous liaisons, but he was unattached, and Mamaine became really the love of his life. Even though she was 20 years his junior, he fell for her hook, line, and sinker and introduced her to his new world. So he, having sold clouds, he bought a very beautiful mill house, which became very famous, called Tickeridge in the Sussex Downs. And there he entertained all his friends to wild bohemian weekend parties, croquet parties, eel fishing parties, fancy dress parties. He was extraordinarily generous, very wealthy, and he had a fantastic wine cellar. And there they all went, and all sorts of relationships and affairs folded and unfolded at Tickeridge. And I'm so sorry, I'd seemed to have superimposed 2 photos on one. But the twins were drawn into this. They were also traveling all over Europe because they'd made all these European friends during their years in Lausanne. And it was the late 30s. And although there were rumblings of war, people were still optimistic that Chamberlain would manage to broker a peace. And they spent quite a lot of time traveling all over Europe, as far as Ruthenia, Czechoslovakia, Prague, Paris, obviously, I mean, everywhere. I mean, their diaries never stop regaling each other with, their travels. And here they are, there's Dick. So the war came, Dick was called up and went on duty all around the country. He was, at that point, perforce separated from Mamaine. And Mamaine and Celia both became nurses. On a couple of years of nursing, they returned to London, where their flat had been sort of requisitioned by that stage by Cyril Connolly and Peter Cornell as an outpost of the magazine Horizon. And they had to more or less wrest their flat back from Connolly and Cornell. But Stephen Spender and Natasha Spender got married in the flat. It was became a sort of hub for London intellectuals and the wider circle of the Horizon pool. And my mother started working on and off at Horizon, and Mamaine got a job working in the Ministry of Economic Warfare. And gradually her relationship with Dick Wyndham, because he was away so much, he then joined Helmsley newspapers and went off to report in the Middle East. Their relationship dissipated, and she met Arthur Koestler early in 1944 at a party given by Cyril Connolly. And that became the central relationship of her life. So here is Arthur early in 1940 on the left, and I included this photograph of him. He had been, as I'm sure you all know, imprisoned in Malaga, Spain in 1936, and was spent 3 months, spent 90 days on death row in Malaga with under sentence of death, with the people in the cells either side of him being dragged out daily, screaming and whimpering to their executions in the courtyard below. And he felt that he was certainly going to be the next one. But in fact, he married a woman called Dorothy Asher in the mid-1930s. And thanks to Dorothy's pressure and pressure from his employers, he was out there working for the News Chronicle, they managed to spring him from jail. He spent an extraordinary subsequent few years basically dodging the Nazis, being holed up in La Verne concentration camp, joining the Foreign Legion, managing to get to England in 1940, where he was immediately thrown into Pentonville jail as an enemy alien until his papers came through, working against the Nazis wherever he was. And by the time Mamaine knew him, he was the author, of course, of Darkness at Noon, and very celebrated journalist, working in London, working for the BBC, working for the Ministry of Economic Warfare, making documentary programs, driving ambulances, basically doing everything he could to help the war effort. So it was it was for both of them a very important relationship. And Arthur and Mamaine, after he returned from a stint in Palestine, decided to buy a house in Snowdonia called Bulch Ochin, where they repaired at the end of 1945. This is Bulch Ochin. There are Arthur and Mamaine having breakfast. And they decided to invite Orwell and his little son, Richard, who was then barely 2 years old. Orwell recently widowed. Eileen had died in March of that year. Animal Farm had been published in August of that year. And they decided to invite Orwell down for Christmas because Arthur and Orwell were working together on their League for the Rights of Man. And they Arthur wanted to discuss it with Orwell over Christmas. And they thought they would invite Celia too, who was single. She'd contracted a marriage during the war, but it didn't last very long. And she was now single again. So they arrive. They take the train down from Paddington Station. I'm sure you all know the story terribly well. My mother, who absolutely loved small children and longed to have a family of her own, was completely smitten with Richard and spent the entire train journey reading through books with him and playing with him, and all was very, very touched by the way that she obviously so sort of felt immediately such a rapport with Richard, but she immediately also felt a great rapport with George. And they spent Christmas together. It was, as ever with Arthur and Mamaine, a pretty wild and drunken affair. And I might just read you just a couple of, there was a wonderful description actually of, sorry, bear with me, oops, of how all was so exhausted by looking after Richard that in order to give him a lie-in, Arthur got up very early one morning and spent literally 2 hours on his hands and knees in front of Richard's cot, making funny faces to try and keep Richard quiet until so that he could have a good lie-in until he woke up. But Richard also drove Arthur mad. Arthur simply refused to have children. He thought they were the cram in the hall. They would stop him ever doing a serious writing ever again. And he did find Richard very testing. Nevertheless, I'm showing you quite a few photos, which I'm sure you know extremely well, all taken, of course, by Vernon Richards, his anarchist friend, because these photos, although they were taken in very early 1946, it was exactly at the period that my mother saw so much of Orwell. So having spent this period in Wales together, Orwell was smitten by my mother, and she agreed very happily to go round to Canonbury Square on a regular basis when Susan Watson, the nanny, was out on a Tuesday, and help Orwell to bathe and put Richard to bed, and just generally to see him. I mean, they got on extremely well. They had a great deal in common. They both shared very bad health. My mother, being asthmatic, being chronic asthmatic, had sort of acute ill health actually. And of course, Orwell had tuberculosis at this point. And they both recognized in each other the sort of fragility that brought to their lives. They both loved Suffolk. I had been brought up in rural Suffolk and literally pined to go back there all her life. It was always her favorite place to be. And Orwell, of course, had spent much of his youth in Lowestoft. They had Suffolk in common. But a more important thing in common, they shared their political ideas exactly and completely. She thought Orwell was a wonderful man. The moment she met him, she realized his quality. She wasn't attracted to him physically. He was 17 years older than her. He was, as she put it, very stuck in his ways. He was by this stage very gaunt with his tuberculosis, but she was very drawn to him as a friend and as a kindred spirit, really. And they also shared the friendship of Inez Holden. Now, Inez Holden was my mother's first cousin. And Inez Holden, as you all know, was extremely close to Orwell as well. And Inez Holden at this point, was in love with and having an on-off and very unsatisfactory affair with Humphrey Slater. Now, Humphrey Slater, ex-fighter in the Spanish Civil War, communist, had recently in the autumn of 1945, launched the periodical Polemic, which was an intellectual periodical, extremely high quality of articles. Sort of every intellectual of the period wrote for it. Orwell wrote for it a lot. Freddie Eyre wrote for it. Bertrand Russell wrote for it. Rupert Corshey Williams wrote for it. It was a very high quality periodical. I'm sure you know it well. And my mother had recently got a job as Humphrey Slater's editorial assistant. So there was, quite apart from the fact that Inez was their first cousin, she was actually 10 years older than the twins, but they'd become close through this connection, through Polemic and through Humphrey Slater. And of course, Orwell and Inez were extremely close friends and had indeed collaborated on theatre reviews at the beginning of the war. They had thought they would publish a war diary together until they realized that their writing styles were too incompatible, but they remained very, very close friends and colleagues, interested in exactly the same things, writing about exactly the same things. Inez in ordnance factories during the war, Orwell obviously writing, as we know, Wigan Pier, etc., etc. Orwell saw in my mother a potential wife and a potential stepmother to Richard, and he proposed marriage several times verbally. And on the 31st of, I've included the envelope here, 31st of January, she received, having turned him down verbally, as it were, he finally resorted to a 4-page letter in which he laid out his reasons for wanting to marry her, which were very pragmatic. I mean, he said he loved her, he desired her, and he said, even if you won't marry me, will you have an affair with me? It would make me feel so much better. Just spend a week as my mistress. Even that would make me feel better. It was a very fond letter, actually. It was a very loving letter. But at this point, my mother had met, through working for Polemic, had met Freddie Eyre. And I'm afraid she had fallen in love with him, and he with her. So she finally persuaded Orwell that she didn't want to marry him, but she was in love with Freddie Eyre. He took it extremely well. He took it on the chin. He said, he's a very impressive man. Let's all have dinner together, 3 of us. He gave her an onyx brooch, and he made it very plain that he wished to go on being a friend of Celia's, even if he couldn't be her husband. So as she said, it's all worked out pretty perfectly as far as I'm concerned, because she wanted to go, very much wanted to go and sing him. And indeed, she went on visiting and looking after Richard in the forthcoming months. This is Inez, 2 rather wonderful photographs of her roughly at the time. Now, I've included a couple of pages from Inez's diaries. The first one on the left was actually from 1941, but I just included it because she says, I sat at a table, I think this was at the Cafe Royal, with Koestler, Connolly, Stevie Smith, Clyde Chapman, Koestler's girlfriend, Daphne Hardy. This was the girlfriend who had actually translated Darkness at Noon. A pretty girl with almost no expression going on her face. René Alvord of La France Libre, who had some other name, and a German refugee writer. Koestler was betting that all would be the greatest bestseller in 5 years' time, and our bet was 5 bottles of Burgundy. So I just thought I'd include that. And this letter here, these pages from her diary here, both detail on the left how about Eileen's death, because she was an extremely close friend of Eileen's. And on the right, Inez was the first person that Orwell visited when he got back from Cologne, having heard of Eileen's death. He went to see her on the spot in her flat. And sorry, I can't read this because I've got photos in front of it, but I don't know if you can read any of this. Can you? after their meeting, she said, I went with George to the station. Trouble is, I can't read it because I've got the photos in front of it. But perhaps, is it clear enough for you to read it on the screen?
Yes, we can.
You can. I'll give you a couple of minutes if you want to read that, because it's a very touching account of how they went to the station. The hurdy-gurdy man was playing. They had a drink. There was sadness in our minds. A man shouted time almost as soon as they'd begun their drinks. I asked George to stay here when he returned to London after the funeral, but he plans to go back to Germany as soon as possible, as he thinks a war correspondent's job will take his mind off his grief. There we go. Meanwhile, Mamaine and Arthur had decided they needed a break in Paris, and they went off there in the autumn of 1946, where Mamaine met Albert Camus. They spent a great deal of their time with Sartre and de Beauvoir, with Albert and Francine Camus, with Malraux as well, Minister of, he wasn't yet Minister of Arts. And they went night clubbing, drinking, arguing, carousing. And there are many accounts in my book of wild nights they all spent together. But to cut a long story short, Arthur had been rather unfaithful, typically. He'd had a fling with Simone de Beauvoir and with another possibly Russian spy. And Mamaine and Camus were deeply, deeply attracted to one another. And it was a sort of coup de foudre. And Mamaine felt that although she was committed to Arthur for the long term, she knew she was committed to Arthur. She said, if Arthur were to leave me, I think I would kill myself. But she also, after meeting up with Camus and Francine several times, and after him imploring her to go away with him, she wrote to my mother that she felt this was the sort of opportunity one would only have once in one's life, and she decided in the end to take it. So she and Camus went off together to the south of France and spent a week together. They met in Avignon. They spent a week wandering around Provence together. And it was during this period that Camus found the village of Lomarin, where he was eventually to buy a house, which is where his family have been based actually ever since. His daughter, Catherine Camus, still lives there in the Rue Albert Camus. They spent a whole week together, absolutely blissful, blissful week. They felt closer to one another than either of them felt to anybody else. I mean, Arthur was an extremely difficult man to live with, and Mamaine had a very, very taxing and volatile relationship with him, an extremely demanding relationship, because he expected her to help him with all his work as a scribe, as a amanuensis, as a sounding board for all his books, as a helpmeet, as a secretary, as a cook, as a lover, as a companion. I mean, he was a very demanding man. He was a very fascinating man. She believed in him completely as a writer and as an intellectual. She found life with him pretty exhausting. And anyway, they had this wonderful relationship, which they knew could not last. It was literally a week out of both of their lives, and they knew they would and should return to their respective partners. From Camus back to Francine and his small children. He had twin children. And Mamaine obviously back to Arthur. They had agreed when they were out there, they'd had something they felt so extraordinary together that they'd agreed that it was too great an infidelity to tell either of their partners about it. But by the time she got back to Wales, Mamaine felt that she had to tell Arthur it was, she couldn't live with him with any integrity without it. And he was absolutely devastated because of all the contenders for Mamaine's affection. Camus was the one he both respected and I was most alarmed by. I knew he was his intellectual equal. He was irresistible to women, and he vastly respected him. And he felt deeply, deeply wounded by this infidelity. and a resentment and a jealousy simmered beneath the surface from then on in. But nevertheless, it had to be done. Mamaine and Camus made a pact that they would try not to see one another simply in order to be able to forget about one another. They couldn't forget about one another unless they truly parted. But after 2 years, they picked up a correspondence, and Camus came over to England to stay with Mamaine, and she shepherded him around London, introduced him to took him to the Houses of Parliament, introduced him to the Horizon Gang, to parties at Hamish Hamilton's, to the prospect of Whitby pub, which he loved more than anything else. They had a lovely week together with Francine as well. She got on very well with Francine, and Francine with her. I'm slightly fast forwarding here. Then Arthur decided to write another book about Palestine. It's 1948, independence in May 1948. Civil war almost immediately broke out, and Arthur determined to go out to Palestine with Mamaine to write about it for the Manchester Guardian and Francois and various other papers, but also to write a book called Promise and Fulfillment, in which he wanted to work out his own unsolved Zionism. And they spent a whole summer out in Palestine together. Just before they arrived, Dick Wyndham, her former lover, but with whom she kept very much in touch, stood up in a trench. He was with the Arab League and was shot by a sniper and killed. So that was quite a tragedy for her. I mean, they parted, but he was still a very important person in her sort of emotional landscape. My mother had gone to Paris for a couple of years, but returned in 1949 and picked up the threads again with Orwell. They'd been corresponding meanwhile. My mother, in fact, donated all her letters except the letter of proposal to the Orwell archive. And I'm sure you will all see them. And of course, they've all been published by Peter Davison in the collected letters. But when she got back to England in 1949, she needed a job, and she went to work for the Information Research Department, recommended by Arthur, who was meanwhile working for them himself. She went to see Orwell, as you all know, in Cranham. He gave her the list of suspected fellow travellers. She took it back to the department. It was typed up, it was filed. It was never seen by anybody else until I found it in my own belongings. Well, I found it in her papers after she died in 2002, and I felt immediately that this was a vital document that I must make public, because there had been so much speculation about it, but it had never been, for official secrets reasons, it had never been seen before. So I took it to Peter Davison, and he included it in his appendix to Orwell's collected writings. And I thought that I must get a sort of really respected journalist to present it to the public. So I contacted Tim Garton Ash, and Tim wrote a huge piece in the Guardian Review, 21st of June 2003, setting the list in context, setting the whole episode, the friendship between Orwell and my mother, the reason he'd given her the list, the consequences of the list for the people involved in the list, etc. And I think many of you may have seen that piece when it came out. Both of the twins, this is just a little letter from Orwell to Mamaine, because she'd sent him a bottle of brandy for his 46th birthday. Both the twins were, of course, at Orwell's wedding lunch, although Orwell's not there. It was given by David Astor and Sonia. And there are Celia Carwin, as she still called herself, and Mamaine Koestler, among Orwell's publishers and very close friends. And they contrived to have as good a time as they could in this very tragic circumstances, that they knew that he had not long to live. And of course, he died 3 months later. Just very briefly, really to finish off, Koestler and Mamaine went to live in France, Vertwiv, just outside Paris. Koestler involved with the cultural freedom. They went off to Berlin in July 1950. And Koestler really, he wrote the manifesto for the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and he was its chief sort of convener. And it was his energy, in a sense, that got the Congress of Cultural Freedom off the ground. He had no idea at the time, and he was absolutely and utterly mortified subsequently to realize that it had been funded by the CIA. And Arthur Koestler, Michael Scammell, his biographer, surmises that he didn't discover until August of that year. And then he had a virtual sort of breakdown. He had a complete meltdown and crashed his car. He was appalled. And he extricated himself then from the Committee for the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Mamaine separated from Arthur, left him really in September of 1951 after 7 extremely stormy but very rewarding years. But her health was fragile. He'd refused to have children. She finally decided she could stand it no longer. And 2 years later, in 1954, she died of asthma. And I reproduce many letters from Camus to Mamaine and also to my mother after Mamaine's death during her illness, which are deeply, extraordinarily moving. And this letter from Camus to Koestler, in which he says that despite their formal rivalry, he feels for Koestler's enormous, enormous loss. And it's the olive branch, the final olive branch between these arch rivals over Mamaine's affections. And that is that. I hope I haven't talked for too long.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and I'm sure everybody thoroughly enjoyed it as I did. Please, could you unmute now and thank Ariane in the appropriate way.
Thank you. Sorry, it was rather a gallop.
No, it was just a job. Very good. So, who would like to ask the first question? Please.
Hi.
Hi, Kristen. How are you?
Hi. I am fine. Thank you for that wonderful talk. It brought the sisters to life. Really remarkable, and I can't wait to see the book when it becomes available to me. I was thinking about the end of your story, which is pretty sad. But I know the story continues in some way. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about Celia and Mamaine's relationship toward the end of Mamaine's life, if they stayed in touch, if it was just sad. I mean, there was such horrible asthma.
They were so close. They were everything to one another. They were, throughout their lives, they wrote to each other constantly whenever they were apart. And of course, they were apart a great deal because Mamaine with Arthur was so peripatetic. London, Wales, Paris, Palestine, America. My mother also went to live in Paris. They were separated an enormous amount of their adult lives. So I have this correspondence. Unfortunately, I have fewer letters from my mother to Mamaine because Mamaine, being so peripatetic, I think lost or mislaid a lot of my mother's letters, whereas my mother kept absolutely all and every one of Mamaine's letters. And from those letters, and I was actually able to conduct this book. I mean, I also constructed it, of course, from all the stories that she told me about their lives together, but they were everything to one another. My mother was absolutely, they were devoted to one another. They were the most important people in each other's lives, despite the men. They really were. And my mother was desperately fraught at Mamaine's illness. She got ill first in March 1954. She suffered a series of increasingly acute asthma attacks. She was hospitalized in several different hospitals, including UCL, where Orwell had died, of course. She spent 2 days of her life completely unconscious after one attack. She was given a series of drugs, every drug that was available on the market, but gradually they lost their efficacy. And she died in the middle of the night on the 2nd of June of 1954 simply heart failure, I think, as a result of one of these attacks. Interestingly, on her death certificate, which I have, it states number 1 reason is exhaustion, and number 2 reason is asthma. She was exhausted by her battle with the asthma, and that had been 3 months of acute illness. During that period, my mother actually married my father, but they'd had to postpone their marriage several times. Of course, Mamaine wasn't there. They had a very, very hasty, rushed marriage in between visits to the hospital. But in marrying my father, my mother took on 2 stepchildren and a small rented farm in Lincolnshire. And she was actually not in London on the night that Mamaine died. She couldn't be with Mamaine literally 24/7. But it was devastating to my mother. And she writes this absolutely tragic letter to Camus, who had been sending desperate notes to her. My dear Albert, Mamaine died this morning in hospital after 3 months' illness. You will understand how I feel. It's as though I had died myself and yet was still alive to suffer. With love, Celia. And I can hardly sort of even read it without weeping. And everybody who knew her was devastated. It was a terrible loss. She was only 37 years old. And, you know, had she been living today, the drugs probably would have worked. But she was also very worn down by the dissolution of her marriage to Arthur, and her lack of, I don't know, she felt without children, what was the point of life? She was not in a good frame of mind at this period either. So anyway, the sisters had never been closer, but there was nothing anybody could do. And then, of course, Arthur and Camus, who had loved Mamaine so very dearly, not transfer their affection to my mother, but they became increasingly close to my mother in the wake of her death. And in fact, I mean, very close indeed. And Arthur and Celia were as close as any brother and sister-in-law could have been. And so I grew up knowing Arthur extremely well, Arthur and his third wife, Cynthia, and we saw an enormous amount of them, and they really were very, very close. And any rancor, my mother was very unjudgmental. She knew that, you know, he'd been an impossible man really to live with, let alone be married to. But she held no rancor because, you know, Mamaine had gone into it with open eyes, and they'd also had enormous happiness and extraordinary richness, as well as the you know, the grief.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for the talk. Actually, I got the book in Hatchards this afternoon, so that's quite a coincidence, actually. But yeah, I just want to ask about the Information Research Department, and how long did Celia actually work for the IRD, and did she never mention anything about that, you know, and about that list? 'Cause I think that list partly came out in the 1990s, and then but the full list didn't come out until, you know, Peter put it in the I think the Lost Orwell in 2005. So I was just wondering, you know, how long she was there, what level of involvement she had with IRD, and you know, did she ever sort of really talked about it, you know, in later years?
She was there for 2 years. She joined in spring of 1949 and left in 1951 to go and work for History Today. She worked with Bob Conquest. They shared an office, the great historian of Soviet Russia. She was a researcher there, really. So her job was to find people to commission to write articles about the Soviet threat, really, and to distribute them as widely as possible throughout the world. Because, as you know, the IRD, it's rather sort of shady department of the Foreign Office. It was probably about 50 strong, I would think. It was founded by Ralph Murray. It was, what else can I tell you about it? I mean, its whole purpose was to counter Soviet propaganda, because Soviet propaganda was so effective. And so the idea was that they would commission articles and indeed distribute books like Animal Farm and 1984, etc., and Darkness at Noon, throughout the world as much as they possibly could, and particularly try to get them to Russia if they could. And so she worked there for 2 years. A very, very interesting job, actually. Sorry, what?
Just thinking about, because I mean, obviously Arthur Koestler, when he found out the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a CIA sort of front, I was just kind of wondering about, because IRD was a bit similar, really, in terms of, it was trying to sort of play a cultural war, if you like, against the Soviet Union. Part of the Cold War secret efforts to move opinion away from sympathy for the the communist cause. So it's quite interesting that both Koestler and Celia ended up sort of involved, maybe one inadvertently and one less inadvertently in some of those activities.
I mean, it was generally not known and not revealed that the CIA were funding the Congress for Cultural Freedom, I think, until well into the 50s, actually. And in fact, it was 1967 that Stephen Spender, who was the editor of Encounter, discovered the involvement of the CIA, and he resigned on the spot. That was 1967. There were rumors about it throughout the 50s, but it wasn't actually established until then. Meanwhile, the IRD was just a rather sort of covert department of the Foreign Office. Well, it had to be rather covert because it was basically doing propaganda itself. So it didn't want to publicize the fact that it was doing this. It was trying to counter the Soviet propaganda by doing its own propaganda.
Well, it was a bit of a U-turn, really, having spent the war going, isn't Joe wonderful?
Yes,
Joe's not wonderful.
Well, absolutely. They had to unpick everything. Adam Watson was my mother's direct boss there. And he said exactly that. He said, we've spent the entire war building up Uncle Joe as our ally. And brushing a lot of Stalin's, more appalling misdemeanors under the carpet deliberately. And now we're pretty keen to make people realize that he's the enemy number one, actually, because he was, through all the peace conferences that basically the Soviets were organizing peace conferences throughout the late 1940s all over the world, Paris, New York, you name it.
Thank you. Peter.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. This is really, in a way, a follow-up question to the previous one. The list is a real conundrum, I think, for Orwell people who are interested in Orwell. On the one hand, it seems to be a violation of Orwell's belief in human decency. On the other hand, there's a question of how significant it really was in that everybody on the list, it wasn't as if he was revealing people who weren't known as being unreliable in the sense of writing. I mean, most of the people were known as being very sympathetic, et cetera, and probably wouldn't have been asked in any case. So in a sense, the list wasn't very significant. But it's very troubling. So I wonder, I mean, did your mother ever say what she really thought about the list? And what do you think about the list?
She was very indignant when sort of news of the existence of the list came out in 1996, I think it was. There was a lot in the papers about Orwell dissed friends. And she said, she tried to sort of quell the controversy surrounding it and the catcalls from voices on the left, accusing Orwell of betraying his friends by stating adamantly and correctly that those named on the list were not his friends, for one thing. She said, I think George was quite right to do it. And of course, everybody thinks that people were going to be shot at dawn. The only thing that was going to happen to them was that they wouldn't be asked to write for the Information Research Department. I mean, she thought it was a massive storm in a teacup, actually, but she wasn't at liberty at that point because of the Official Secrets Act, to reveal the list herself. So it wasn't until I found it among her papers after her death that I realized by that stage I had to reveal it because there'd been so much inaccurate speculation about who was on it. And I mean, it was a fairly mild list, really. I mean, the worst that Orwell said about any of the people on it was Peter Smollett, who was indeed, as it turned out, a Soviet spy. Very slimy person, as you know. And Peter Smollett was given the OBE, for God's sake. I mean, none of these people suffered in consequence of being on that list. Not one of them. Several of them got honours, subsequently got honours. It didn't do their careers any harm or their reputations any harm, actually. They're mostly dead by the time that the actual list came out in 2002.
Well, but at the same time, there's this sort of residual feeling that it wasn't a nice thing of Orwell to have done, isn't there?
Well, he was, first of all, she asked him to write himself for the IRD, and he was simply too ill at that point in his life to do it by March 1949. He said he couldn't do it himself. So all he could do was to help to advise about people that they should commission and those they shouldn't. And it was all he could do. And he felt so incredibly strongly about the Soviet threat. That this was kind of his last, his last chance to actually do something practically to help the aims of this department, with whose aims he completely and utterly agreed.
Surely the perspective to look at it is this was an act of a patriot.
Well, perhaps he would have felt that. I don't know. He felt it was his last throw at the dice.
Mm.
He knew he was dying. He didn't even know he would live into 1950.
Mm.
He was extremely ill, and he felt this was his last throw at the dice. And it was mild. Most of these names simply had question marks against them.
Mm.
And very, very brief comments indeed. So my mother was certainly very indignant about all the hoo-ha. And so am I.
Very good. Les.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I've got two questions, but I'll ask the first one and only ask the second if no one else raises a hand. Did your mother ask other leading figures to produce suggestions of who should and should not write for the IRD? Are there lists apart from Orwell's in the archives? Do you know?
No, I discovered nothing else. She certainly, if she had done, she didn't keep it. She must have done, I'm sure. She was extremely well connected.
Yeah, well, they'll be well hidden away, won't they? If other people produce lists.
But it's a really interesting question, because to be honest with you, I don't know the answer. But she was so well connected that I can't believe that she didn't ask other people, because that was what the department was there to do. Was there to find out the best people, the most trustworthy people, to produce these articles against Soviet, spread of Soviet terror, as it were. Yeah. What was your second question?
Right. Okay. Changing the subject completely. I'd like to thank you for the shots of Inez Holden's diaries. They've not been published in their entirety. I think Christine Blumel has seen them in their entirety. You've given her access to them.
My mum did, yeah.
I mean, we've got Handheld Press to thank for republishing several volumes of Inez's work, and the most recent one was a collection of her stories for Punch, published by the Anthony Powell Society, to which you made a major contribution in the introduction. By talking about the work that Inez did with Orwell early in the war, when they seem to have written at sometimes each other's theatre reviews, which I don't think anyone had appreciated before. So this is more fantastic information coming out about the intellectual environs that Orwell was in, of how far he was actually working with other people. Whom he was meeting socially, but clearly was mixing with intellectually. And I wonder, is anything going to go forward in the publishing of Inez's diaries?
I don't know. I will have another look at them, but they are very personal. And DJ Taylor feels that she deserves a biography in her own right. I'm not convinced yet about that. She had actually she was the most life-enhancing person and one of the funniest women on the planet, but she actually had a rather sad life. And I mean, she had a terrible, appalling family. Her first memory was of her mother trying to shoot her father and missing, during one of the many, many blazing rows. She had a terrible, terrible family life, which she escaped at the age of about 15. They never even registered her birth or paid her school fees. They sent her to a school for poor tradespeople, and her uncle had to pick up the bill. She went to Paris. She came back to London. She was one of the bright young things. She was extraordinarily talented and witty, but she actually was very unhappy in love. And I don't know. I really don't know about a biography. I mean, Christian, I'd love to know what you think, because you read her diaries and you have written about her. What do you think? Does she deserve a biography in her own right? I think you're muted.
I don't know. I'm not doing well here on an international Zoom call, coming up with a good answer to that question.
Sorry to spring it on you.
But here's what I've been thinking about. I don't want to contribute too much and take space, but I've been thinking about women's lives, as I always do, women's writing and women's work, and how much work women do that's unpaid. And the idea that your aunt and your mother were writers, but aren't known as writers. Inez was a writer, but she never got married to a famous man who was a writer. So we've, now Mamaine and Celia, and also beauty, right? That what if they had been identical twins who were ugly?
Yeah,
gorgeous. I mean, it's astonishing. That is so important to the conversation. But you can be Orwell, and okay, Orwell people, he was not handsome. I hate to tell you this, but he isn't. And thank you, Masha, for laughing. But right, so women fell for him not because he had a great lantern jaw, and they fell in love with him because of who he was, not for what he looked like. But things for women were very complicated around beauty, work, writing. And in that period of time, if you didn't get married, it was really, really hard. I mean, those poignant kind of conversations between Mamaine and Celia, and then talking about Sonia when she's marrying Orwell, and they're like, oh, just not to be single again, to actually have an assured, essentially, paycheck. So those are my thoughts. And I think Inez is so interesting as almost a parallel but counter model, because she didn't get married to Koestler and she didn't have Orwell as a spouse or something like that. So
just a slight counter argument. My mother and Mamaine spent their entire time, well, my mother in particular, turning down proposals of marriage. And at one point, Mamaine writes to her, she's being pursued by Bob Conquest. And Mamaine writes to her, I do feel sorry for you. It's a dog's life having people wanting to marry one all the time, unkind as it sounds to say so. I mean, they spent a lot of their time turning down proposals of marriage. They would prefer to be single than get married to somebody they weren't in love with.
But I think they would not want to be described as ugly.
So they most certainly weren't.
Us too.
Gorgeous.
Yeah, okay, but interesting. I'm so sorry, I can't really answer about Inez at the moment. She's an extraordinarily fascinating character, but I'm not sure that she would have wanted a biography of herself, to be honest with you. But I am thinking of writing more about her, certainly. And I do have her diaries. And I am her executor through my mother.
Yeah. Thank you. Phyllis and Nemo.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Thank you. Women may not have been attracted to George Orwell because of his looks, although taste and appearance do vary. But it certainly doesn't follow from that they were attracted mainly, or let alone entirely, because of his fame. They might have been attracted by his character, personality, and moral strength. I find that attractive.
Oh, yes, very
Or
much.
by his brilliance, which is a separate matter from his fame.
I think my mother was very attracted by his integrity. I mean, she said the moment she
That's
met
part of
him,
his character.
she felt he was an extraordinary person. She said, I want to be friends with George. She felt he was a very remarkable individual from the moment they met on that train in Paddington.
He'd also be a friend you could trust because of his integrity.
And that's why she was so delighted that he took the rebuff to his proposal so well and wanted to carry on being friends with her. And both twins were brilliant at turning sort of love or attraction into friendship. They just, because they cared about people deeply. And she cared about him deeply. She cared about him deeply. She really did. And she was absolutely shattered when he died. Shattered.
Thank you, Masha.
I also have two questions. First of all, I wanted to thank you, Ariane. It was very, very interesting what you told us. And my first question was about Robert Conquest. I mean, I hadn't known that he wanted to marry her, but I wanted to find out about your mother's views on the Soviet Union and basically his work in this respect. That's question number one, and then I'll ask the second one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Of course, my mother wouldn't have worked with the IRD, wouldn't have accepted the job at the IRD if she hadn't been as, if she hadn't felt as strongly as she did that the Soviet Union was a major threat. I mean, after all, she had spent the last 6, 7, 8 years closely to people like Koestler and Orwell and others who felt exactly the same. In fact, some of the biggest rows they had in Paris with Sartre and de Beauvoir was because they felt that Sartre was absolutely not as anti-Soviet as he should have been. You know, he kept sort of letting the Soviets off the hook, as it were. For instance, equating the Soviet Gulag camps with the displacement people camps in Europe after the war. You know, it caused major rows and disruptions. And my mother was fervently of the belief that the Soviet Union was an encroaching threat. Yes.
Was she in touch with Conquest in later years, or
yes.
Yeah?
A bit, yes. And I actually went to see Robert Conquest myself in 2003 after her death. They kept up a sort of not very regular correspondence because he'd moved to America by that stage,
Yes.
married.
Yeah. Yeah. And the second question is not political, but rather psychological, because when you were showing their photographs as children as young women, I was wondering, are you always absolutely sure who's who? And maybe you can sort of give us a hint how you recognize them. And the part of it is, in what way were they different? Okay. Because they obviously were different women. So in what way?
Well, that's a very good question. The answer to the first question is I don't always know who's who. Actually, there is a photograph that was in the Madame Yvonne exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery last autumn of them both. And I don't include it in the book, and I haven't included it here because it was, they hated being debutantes, but I simply have not a clue which of them is which. There are two profiles sort of superimposed on each other and I haven't a clue. But in fact, they were, of course, not absolutely identical in temperament. I think Mamaine was the more brittle and in a way the more extrovert of the two. I say that because I got all her letters and I don't have so many of my mother's letters back for reasons I explained earlier. But I think Mamaine, I think they were, they weren't totally the same, but I cannot always tell them apart in photographs. I really can't. And actually they confused, I mean, they deliberately confused their friends. There was one evening in Paris when my mother had dinner with Sartre, and under the pretense of being Mamaine, just to see how long she could get away with it for. And basically she got away with it for hours. And there's also another story of Mamaine meeting my mother's first husband, Patrick Cowan, about 5 years after my mother had divorced him. And they sat on the top of a bus together. And for quite a while, Patrick Cowan thought that Mamaine was my mother. So there you go. And he'd been married to my mother. So, but of course, I never saw them together because she died the year before I was born.
Yeah. Yeah, and your mother, what was she of a milder temperament, you would say, than Mamaine? Yeah, a bit.
Slightly milder, slightly less, as I say, slightly less febrile, slightly less brittle than Mamaine. But obviously that was just a question of degree. It wasn't a major thing.
Yeah, and who of them came first? Who was born first? Do you know?
I can't remember. I think it was my mother by half an hour, but it was only half an hour or something.
Mamaine?
No, I think it was my mother.
Your mother, right, right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's all absolutely fascinating, and all the people they met and befriended, the two of them, I think that makes an extraordinary list. And thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I think the fact that they achieved so much from having no mother, the most extraordinary young childhood, through to becoming adults, no formal education, to I mean, they must have had superb intellects to overcome all that and do what they did.
I must read you all to amuse you. So last weekend, there was a double-page centerfold spread in the Daily Mail of a digest of this book. And as a result of which, there were some incredibly funny comments online. And one of them, referring to the twins, was from a, I don't know who this person is. They call themselves Hope for the Future. The quote is, "Real women, no silicone breasts, no fillers, minimal makeup, and brains." Really amused me. They had brains. They had a lot of brains. My mother was the most highbrow, one of the most highbrow people I've ever met. She would always have sort of Schopenhauer or something by her bedside, or Proust, or whatever it was. They were both autodidacts. They learnt ancient Greek. Mamaine learnt Turkish. They played the piano for up to 4 hours every day. They read voraciously in many languages. My mother was always up with the latest fiction in translation from all over the world. Poetry, she read poetry as it was being published. She was a real intellectual, my mother. And she chose to live in Cambridge because most of her friends were dons and intellectuals as well. So that's where we grew up. She really was a very clever woman. And Mamaine must have been too. So it shows that education is not, formal education is not everything, I suppose.
Well, no, I mean, there's a good argument that in some cases people have had formal education that stunted rather than enhanced their ability.
Yeah.
Not all education is of equal value.
No, and some of education is really bad education.
Yeah, indeed. And ask us, Ian.
Thank you. Like everyone who's asked questions, I thought it was a fascinating talk, and thank you very much. Your mom died in 2002, I think, in her mid-80s. Did you ever discuss with her the possibility of a book about her and her sister, or did you ask her whether she might write it?
She was approached by quite a few people about writing her memoirs because everybody realized what an extraordinary life she'd had, but she demurred. She felt, well, firstly, I think what she did do is she published a collection of Mamaine's letters to her called Living with Koestler, which came out in 1985 from Weidenfels and St. Martin's Press in America. with a very, very good introduction and commentary and footnoted by her. But that was as far as she really wanted to go. But she left me all her papers on the understanding, I think, that I would write them up. But I think she felt she didn't have the energy for it. She often said, I don't want to write a book of literary gossip. It would just be a book of literary gossip. And I don't want to do that. But I think she thought or knew that I would eventually do it myself. And she, as it were, gave me her blessing. And a lot of people, of course, were still alive when she would have been writing her book, who are now dead. Maybe she felt that was a constraint as well.
And it took you the better part of 20 years to actually do it, though.
Well, it did, because actually I started in about 2006. It actually made me too sad. I think it was part of the grieving process for losing my mother. And then I put it on the back burner, and I was simply so busy with other projects that I didn't actually get down to it till lockdown. But I was thinking about it all the time. But I was also trying to work out the structure. It was very difficult to work out how to create a narrative arc from two such extraordinarily busy, peripatetic, parallel lives. I mean, I left so much stuff on the cutting room floor. It's not actually a very long book. It could have been twice the length, but if I'd put in, I mean, they knew so many people. They went to so many places. Do you know what I mean? It could have been just a rag bag. And I felt it was very important to create a narrative arc that would be easy for people to follow, given that these two lives, I was writing a double biography. And it took me a long time to work out how to do that, actually.
Thank you.
Once I started, it all went very quickly.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, that has been a wonderful evening, Ariane. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for asking me.
It's been a huge pleasure. Next month, it will be back to a sort of normal time of the month, because we brought this forward partly to coincide with Ariana's publication date, and partly because I'll be with the group of members in Spain when we would normally have it. So next month it's the 16th of June, and it's Les Wilson talking about his very interesting book Orwell's Island, where he addresses Orwell's antipathy to the Scots being overcome by contact with people who weren't gin-swilling colonials. But it's a very interesting book. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Ariane. That was terrific.
Thank you. Bye.